Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, 13 years ago, the shock of the broken levees and floodwater around us was a warning that we could never pay too little attention to the Louisiana coast. Well, tonight we continue the mission of keeping up with the coast, including sea levels rising, the condition of the levee system, cost issues for the shrimp industry, saving our delta, and what's so special about Queen Bess Island? Discussing these and other topics are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Bob Marshall, environmental columnist, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune. Travis Lux, coastal reporter, WWNO 89.9 FM radio. And Mark Schlefstein, environmental reporter, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune. And we're going to go over to Mark first and sort of generally approach now. Let's take a look at our coast. It's our coast, and it's been disappearing, and which threatens us all. The state has a master plan. They've been coming up with master plans now, or some sort of approach, since right after the storm.
Since 2007.
And the most recent one was 2017 master plan, $50 billion. So how's it going?
Well, there's good news, and then there's less good news. Let's put it that way. The first thing is that the state has money. It has a lot of money, and it has a source of money that's going to continue for another 13 to 14 years, largely as a result of the BP oil spill. So we're looking at least $7 million, a little bit more, over the next 14 years from the spill. That's all going to be used for coastal restoration projects. You got another $1.2 billion from Federal Coastal Wetlands Planning Grant Program, QIPRA. Then you've also got about $2 billion that the state expects to get from the offshore oil, and another about $300 million that the state expects to get from onshore oil. So you put all that together, and you've got a heck of a lot of projects that are already underway or are in the planning stages and will be started in the next couple of years, which is really, really important for the restoration process. So
we need to, restore the coast. We need to rebuild some land. Are we doing that?
We are rebuilding land, and indeed the last U.S. Geological Survey look at the coastline showed, ironically, that while most of the coast is still losing land, it's losing land at a less fast rate, only a football field every 100 minutes instead of every 60 minutes. That's a positive sign. Well, a significant portion of that change is a result of projects where we've been dredging material from the Gulf, from the Mississippi River, and putting it inland in Barataria Bay. So that's a key point, and those projects will continue on, as will another two major sediment diversions that are planned and have money ready for them to get built, but are having to go through the permitting process.
Mark, you said there was good news and less good news. What's the less good news?
Well, the less good news is that, we've got all that money, and it's all for coastal restoration. There's really not been a way of identifying dollars going for levees. Ironically, that's not quite true, because just a couple of weeks ago, Congress approved supplemental legislation this year dealing with hurricanes that includes a big chunk of money, $760 million, to fully pay the cost up front of building the West Shore Lake Pontchartrain extension of the levee system on the lakefront, so in St. John Parish.
And we're going to be getting to levees too, in a little bit further in the discussion. I wanted to touch base again on the diversions. The diversions stir up a lot of controversy.
Stir up a lot of controversy. There's an effort by Amos Cormier III, the president of Plaquemines Parish, to put the kibosh on the state's plans. He's attempted to not give them permission to take soil samples in the area, and the state basically said, well, we've got state law on our side. It says we can go into any land and take those samples, and they've already done it. So that's still going to be a problem moving forward, but we'll see what happens. It may end up in court. We'll have to see.
And what's the status of the diversions right now? Are they being planned, designed?
The state has hired firms to do the design portion for both of them, and the Army Corps of Engineers has a whole batch of people working on the environmental impact statement, which is probably the biggest thing that's happening. The state actually helped that process along by putting money forward, and the Trump administration has helped as well by speeding up the process of how long it will take to get some things approved, and basically saying you guys don't even have to look at the effects of the Marine Mammal Safety Act on this thing, that we're saying it's already approved.
Okay, but once again, there's still controversy
Still
about it, and there certainly
controversy,
still will be discussions and hearings, et cetera. And
largely from fisheries.
Yeah, and those who support the diversion say, look, we really just don't have any more time. Now, for
that's
discussion,
true.
We're losing land still at a pretty rapid rate. It may be 90 minutes instead of 60.
Right, and the issue is that, you know, the state contends that the fisheries folks will be losing the ability of going after the fisheries that they're looking at, oysters, shrimp, finfish that they are catching now, and crabs, because the wetlands are disappearing and it's becoming more difficult for those species to exist, whether or not these projects get done.
Okay, well, certainly sea level rise and subsidence playing a part in the loss of our coast and the issue of climate change, which also there's some who dispute it. And you wrote an article, a column fairly recently, to say criticizing Steve Scalise and his position on carbon taxes is really putting it mildly. You don't agree with not agreeing with the carbon tax, apparently.
Well, yeah, I think it's a suicide vote for the coast of Louisiana. And in fact, that's basically what the state has said in its last master plan. The 2017 master plan says that how much we can save depends on how much emissions, carbon emissions, are reduced. They said right now, even if we get all the money, by the way, it'll cost about, if you add inflation, about $92 billion by 2067. Even if we find all the money, build all the projects on time, and they work according to all the computers, we're still going to lose 1,200 square miles of what we have today if the Paris Accords on carbon reduction work. If they don't work, we could lose up to 2,800 square miles. So, you know, that's the whole thing, and people are beginning to question nationally. And by the way, our Republican legislature unanimously approved this plan. This is the state's official policy. This is their statement on the most important thing we need to do. So people across the country are beginning to ask questions. I know Mark gets these questions. He speaks at a lot of places. I speak all over the place. And they're asking me, wait a minute, if we don't reduce emissions, why should we spend $92 billion on this plan if it's not going to be able to accomplish this stuff, if you're still going to lose all this property? So it's essential. And carbon emissions are what's driving sea level rise. And there's no discussion about that in the scientific community worldwide. And the best way, most economists believe, the best way to reduce emissions would be have a market-based policy like a carbon tax, so that people will then go to alternative forms of energy, stop using as much gas, that type of stuff.
What's a projection of sea level rise for our coast as we move along in this century?
Well, it keeps changing. NOAA has said in the last few years, when you combine our sinking, our subsidence, with eustatic sea level rise from warming, this area could see 5 to 5.5 feet by the end of the century. But let's go back to what the state's own computers are telling it, is how much land we will lose by 2067. This isn't by the end of the century. They're talking as much as 2,800 square miles. I mean, you're looking at most places below US 90, in bad shape.
You talk to folks who live down in that area, they just keep saying, used to be land, now water, everywhere they point.
I think one of the interesting things about this whole argument is that the state already has built into its master plan and into state law the ability of capturing the carbon credits that might come from that kind of tax and using that money to rebuild wetlands. And the other key thing about it is that the state of Louisiana, when you look at industrial emissions of carbon dioxide, they're the third largest in the country. So if you were able to reduce that in Louisiana, it would be our own industries that would be adding money to coastal restoration.
And we've already lost, what, over 2,000 or about 2,000 square miles?
About
Since
2,000
that
square
is
miles.
really the estimate they say.
Yeah, I mean, it makes no sense. God helps those who help themselves. Why would anyone want to invest here if the state-owned congressional delegation doesn't support addressing the worst enemy we have, which now
What is his reasoning for voting that way?
taxes. He said it was bad for America and working families. He actually represents the 1st Congressional District, which is the most threatened. We've lost more coastal property in his district than anywhere in the state.
I think one of the other issues has to deal with that whole question of, well, how much does it cost and how do you do this? Well, we saw when the Toxics Release Inventory was approved in 1987. It's a law that just says, just list how much you're putting into the air, land, and water. The state of Louisiana ended up investing $5 billion in the first 5 years after that law into changing the way that industry does its job, and the result of that was improved conditions, more money for the state, and more jobs.
All right, so back to the master plan real quick, if I can have you touch on that just for a second. If we don't do what's in the master plan, the projected land loss comes to what? Instead of 2,000, it's even more than that square miles. What about
as much as what,
4,000?
4,000, a future without action. But that's not going to happen. They're already working, and we have the money to keep going forward. But what the state really needs to do is I think also, is to do an economic study, explaining to people how much we can gain by going ahead and building what we can build.
Right.
Even if maybe some of that's flooded by the end of the century, there is an economic value.
And
preserving
the state is
local.
beginning to do that this week. They've started putting out these storyboards that are showing things like how much are you at risk from schools
And education,
and
health, and
hospital.
transportation. Yeah, I want to refer people to that site in just a second. But right now, I want to get over to Travis and to Travis and talk about. We're talking about impacts on people who make their livelihood on the coast and what it's doing to them. And I know you've talked to shrimpers lately who oftentimes are not pleased with what they're getting for per pound shrimp, but they really are having trouble right now.
Yeah, this year seems to be particularly bad, or they say so anyway, this year and last. Some shrimpers were saying that they're getting for their smallest shrimp on the order of about 30 to 40 cents per pound, which is pretty low. I was talking to someone who is no longer in the industry. He was 25. He got out last year because he had 2 kids and he couldn't make it. He sold his boat. He said his truck got repoed. And basically what he was saying is his grandfather did this too, and his grandfather took really meticulous logs. Like he wrote down every day what the weather was doing, what the water was doing, what he got at the dock for shrimp that day. And he was looking at the logs, and the price that his grandfather was getting back then was almost identical to what shrimpers have been getting lately now. And so they've really been complaining about these prices, saying we just can't make it. And so there's been a lot of talk. There was a little bit of talk earlier this year. They were flirting with the idea of going on strike. They didn't do that. And so I think a lot of them feel kind of caught between a rock and a hard place when it comes to trying to make ends meet.
Yeah, and the costs for them are just higher than what it was for this
Right,
shrimper you're talking about.
right.
His granddad costs for a lot less now.
Right, right.
For stuff like fuel and just the
Fuel,
supplies they need.
all the supplies, it's much more expensive now than it was back then.
Is it imports still that's their biggest problem, enemy?
That's what they're saying. I mean, that's what they place most of the blame on right now, is that the imports, imported shrimp is just driving down the price. And it, according to the data, the country is importing more shrimp than it ever has before. So that's kind of been the main focus, is that they want to see fewer imports.
And the issue there is that it's not wild-caught shrimp that they're importing.
Right.
It's all farm-raised shrimp. And the farm-raised shrimp does not show all of the environmental costs of those farms that are occurring in foreign countries. And it's ironic that we're seeing all these tariffs being issued by the president,
Right.
and we have not seen
it
that.
on that. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Senator John Kennedy asked President Trump to include shrimp on the Chinese tariff list, but the last list that I saw, shrimp was not included.
So the shrimpers continue to have a hard time, certainly. So the idea is support Louisiana shrimpers, eat Louisiana shrimp.
Sure, yeah, and Lieutenant Governor has a plan, which it kind of feels like a tariff in a way, which is to basically charge importers for an inspection fee, a food inspection fee, 10 cents per pound. The idea is that it will, by doing more inspections on imported shrimp, there will be more rejected product because of some of these antibiotics and environmental concerns, and that therefore might make the prices more competitive.
Right.
But most people I've talked to have said that that's not going to do anything, even if that came to fruition.
Okay, well, we'll see how it goes for the shrimpers. Thanks a lot, Travis. Errol, over to you. Queen Bass Island, that's an important one.
Yeah. But first of all, I mentioned, there was a time, the popularity of crawfish is fairly recent. I think it goes back maybe to the 60s or something like that. There was a time people had shrimp boils the way they have crawfish boils now. And what drove that out of the way was when they started selling shrimp out of state, the prices went so high, all of a sudden it opened the way for the crawfish industry too. So I say bring back the shrimp boils, and that might help the industry too.
I agree. Queen Bess.
Off of Grand Island, there's an island called Queen Bess Island, and this is the 50th anniversary of an effort that began. Louisiana Wildlife and Fisheries started importing pelicans from Florida, from around Tampa. And that first, between 68 and 76, they bought something like 767 pelican chicks to that island. And eventually nests started to appear, and then all of a sudden we started having hatchlings, and it was the beginning of the new pelican project. And so it's actually the 50th year of the rebirth of the pelican living in New Orleans. Before that, there weren't any left because of DDT. And so the state bird didn't even exist in Louisiana. So it's been a very successful program. As of, I think, 2007, they were like 4,000 pelicans that they were counting. And then the next year, they took the pelicans off the endangered species list. And I remember that week before Katrina, being out by the lakefront and seeing the pelicans gliding over the lake, and what a wonderful scene it was to see the pelicans coming back. Of course, after Katrina, they went away for a while. But it's been one success story, a very good story. And there are other birds also on Queen Bess Island, and so it's just been a happy effort up to this point.
Right off of Grand Isle, right? Queen
Yeah.
Bess Island is.
I remember
Right,
when
it is.
Charlie Frank, who was a great, actually, waterfowler and decoy carver, is responsible for having saved Queen Bess Island by getting the Corps to pump its dredge material from the Barataria Seaway inside. Queen Bess was falling apart like all those islands, so they put rocks around it. And every year, we go out there every year for weeks in a row as the pelicans nest and then the young ones hatch.
So how's it looking? I mean, is it being threatened also still?
Queen Bess was really hit hard by the BP oil spill, and it really exacerbated some of the loss of the wetlands that make up the interior of the island. The state now has a new project where it is completely rebuilding the island. That's one of the projects that will be paid for with money from the BP oil spill that is specifically directed towards helping birds. And And so that's a benefit. But the thing to remember is that Queen Bess also is in an area where it is at greatest risk of both sea level rise and subsidence. So it's something that's going to have to be, we're going to have to get used to this. We're going to have to be rebuilding these islands for the birds every couple of years, every 20, 30 years. We're going to have to go back out there and pump more material on.
In Land for People, people think, I think there's an impression that, oh, if we get to 2067, the master plan's done. No, that's the first step.
Yep.
Then it's, if we want to live here, we have to have the master plan going forever.
Keep maintaining it.
Yes.
To keep maintaining, I mean, that's certainly something that is stated about the dredging and building it through dredged materials. That okay, you build a chunk of land, but you got to keep going there and keep
Absolutely.
rebuilding it.
That's
Whereas with the sediment
that's one of the-
diversions, it's a little bit more
One of the key
consistent.
reasons why the diversions are part of the whole strategy is that they provide access every 4 or 5 years when you have a high river. You open up the gates. Fully,
Right.
and you're pouring all that stuff in, and you end up with sediment that goes on top of the existing islands and wetlands and builds new
And
land.
it's Mississippi River sediment that built this delta.
It is.
Right.
So it's something that it will, and it is continuing to build in some areas like Wax Lake and the Chafalaya,
Right.
and also West Bay Diversion. You would see some land being built there. Let me get you to talk a little bit about the levees now and the condition of the levees. How at risk are we?
Okay, so where are we? Well, the thing to remember here, there's a couple of key issues here. The first one is that we have the best levee system in the United States and maybe the world. We have levees that are built to the standards that our flood insurance is designed to help us from, which is the quote 1% 100-year event.
Are you talking about the river levees or all levees?
Well, the
system.
river levees are part of the system, but really talking about the hurricane levees that are on the backsides, on the lakefront and on the West Bank. So they were all rebuilt after Katrina to these brand new standards after all of the lessons learned from the failure of a lot of those levees and flood walls during Katrina. So that's the good news. The bad news is that a 100-year levee system is not enough. That's everybody knows that. It's basically an ancient standard created to make a distinction between farmland and populated areas along the Mississippi River and other rivers, and it's being used for hurricanes, and it really doesn't work very well. But the reality is that that's the way that hurricane levees are funded, and so we're stuck with that. The state agreed to upgrade the East Bank part of that levee system as part of the Coastal Master Plan beginning in 2012. The first time they did that, they said, well, we're going to increase the height by 3 feet, and that'll bring us up to 500-year level. Well, guess what? The 2017 plan includes the exact same idea, but the difference is that just keeps us at 100 years.
Not 500 years.
So that's where it is. So where are we? Well, the reality is that the Corps of Engineers says we're at high risk of flood events. And it's not because the levees aren't improperly built. They're perfect. They're great. The problem is that we live behind a system that is only there to protect us from a 100-year event, and that's an event that occurs once in the life of a 30-year mortgage. So we should expect that that is part of our risk. So is that terrible? Well, we have something that no one else has. You go to Miami, there aren't any levees there. They're at high risk. You go to New York City, it's the same thing. You go to Sacramento where the levees are junk, and they're at high risk as well, even though they've got a very large levee system, and the reason is because their levees do not meet the new standards yet.
So go ahead, Bob.
Well, you know, the levees in 1963, when the system was first passed by Congress, we were authorized to have levees high enough to meet the most severe meteorological event likely to happen here. These don't do that. Obviously the ones that were building up until Katrina, which they improperly built and collapsed and killed 1,400 people, these are much better, but they're still not to the design specs that the original law said we should have back in 1963. So, but Mark's right. People ask me this all the time. Is it safe here, safer? Those are great levees. They will be overtopped. What does that mean? Well, if the pumps are working, it won't mean much. But if you have a 30-year mortgage, yeah.
The reality is that there's new information out there that if you have a 500-year event that goes up against this system, it's going to basically stay dry, believe it or not. So that's the positive sign.
That's very positive.
If
So they won't be
everything
overtopped?
works, it will not be overtopped. If everything works, and there will be overtopping from waves.
Yeah.
So there will be some flooding. In 2007, they said, well, maybe the potential for as much as 5 feet. Today, depends on what storm you're looking at. West Bank's still got some problems, but East Bank, maybe not. So that's a positive sign.
That is, so we're stronger in our levee system certainly than we were before Katrina.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, one other
Absolutely.
point. In the Netherlands, their system is built for the 50,000-year storm.
No.
We're for the 100-year storm.
So if we see a big one coming and they'd order us to evacuate,
Oh,
we
absolutely.
definitely
There are
take
no
it by
country
some-
there.
The thing to remember is that the levee system is built to protect your property. It's not built to protect you.
Exactly.
So you have to
The
protect
portion of the
yourself.
system, and it is a system that is built to protect you, is the evacuation plan. And that means that you have to take your life into your own hands and make plans at the beginning of the hurricane season of where you're going to go and when you're going to leave, which is when they tell you to go.
Which is really important. Okay, I'm going to ask you guys now to wrap up this conversation with what do you feel is your biggest, what do you feel have been the biggest victories or disappointments in this whole issue of our coast and protection? Errol, I'll start with you.
Well, there's certainly environmentally, I guess, a little bit beyond the coast. I think what happened to the saving of Lake Pontchartrain, that the original effort to save it, when they stopped all the dredging of the shells and all that, and they really cleaned up the lake, and they made it. Remember, people couldn't swim in Lake Pontchartrain, and then after Katrina, the way it was able to bounce back and the way it was able to fix itself, I thought that was very encouraging.
Bob.
Believe it or not, I'm going to say the BP oil spill, because without it, we wouldn't have most of the money we have now to keep going with our coastal master plan.
All right. Travis, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be sort of a spokesperson for the state, but I do think that the master plan does seem like, I mean, it's been going through several iterations now. It seems like there's a lot of good ideas in there. There's controversy with some of those ideas, but it does seem like a pretty strong plan, that it's really pretty well resourced and thought out. So I think that's, despite all the land loss, that's a
It's a
kind of
victory, and it's an evolving thing too, because they keep visiting it every 5 years. Mark.
And I'm going to be on a little bit more the negative side, and point out that one of the key failures immediately post-Katrina was the Road Home program and its inability to deal with people who were low and moderate income. And that's something that still has not been built into plans to mitigate future damage when we have the next event.
And if you want more information about this issue that we've been talking about, you can go to the Coast website, the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority, and you see the address there, coastal.la.gov, and they've got a community awareness plan going with a whole lot of information there for you to learn more. Thanks a lot, guys. This has been a really interesting discussion. Thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us, and of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.